Hi everybody, it's me, Tim. Today I'm going to do the Wildstar class summary from November 2008. I found this file from 2008 that I had created at home because I've mentioned in my other Wildstar videos that when I became design director, I was given 90 days to completely design all the classes for the game. Because there was a big meeting in November. And I actually have it. It's November 13th, 2008. So that was about 90 days after I started as design director with all, except for one person, all new design hires. I want to go over this summary because I think it's, first of all, it's interesting that I have this. Where I found this, I did it on my own laptop. I had a really funky HP TC1100C, I think it might have been. It looks like this. Really cool laptop. Really good keyboard, detachable, turns it completely into a tablet. It was probably the coolest laptop I've ever owned, even till now. And I got it, wow, this thing would be, I probably got it in 2006 or something. Anyway, I regularly backed it up because I was always worried that, maybe I'd drop it or lose it or have it would get stolen. So I had all these regular backups, and I found the PowerPoint presentation that I gave. So I'm going to do it for you today. So this is all of the classes that were designed for Wildstar back when it was still called Sanctuary, which was its old name, as of 2008, which is 3 years before I left and 6 years before it shipped. So you can compare these classes to the classes that I actually shipped with. So let's get started. Here's the title screen, Sanctuary Class Summary. What I'm going to talk about here is I'm going to talk about what the class design goals were. Remember, when I started doing design documents, I love to give, here's the goals we're working on. That way you can separate discussions into, do you think these are good goals? And do you think these classes meet the goals? Then I'm going to talk about what class features are shared by all classes, the common features. And then I will present each one of the 9 classes and what they're really good at. And then I had a final slide on, here's stuff that's coming up soon. Here are the class design goals for Wildstar. All the different combat roles had to be represented. That's, DPS, ranged, tank, crowd control, all of them. All the classes had to be on an archetype that was blended somewhere between magic and tech. I was very familiar with doing this from Arcanum, but Wildstar had its own vibe to it. Every one of the features, the class powers, had to be somehow tied to the lore. I wanted to have it very connected that way, that the classes were there. Remember, I did do setting, and then story, and then system mechanics. So these system mechanics had to support that setting. I wanted the abilities to work the exact same way in PvE and PvP, which means if you were okay with players getting stunned or knocked out, great. If you're not, don't put that in PvE if you're not going to have it in PvP. All the classes should be able to play the game solo. Rating should not depend on a specific class. I'd played too many MMOs where you literally could not do a class or do not do a raid if one or more classes weren't present. I didn't want any of that to be true. It's especially true if you have like one healing class, so everybody feels like you have to have that class there. I wanted all the classes balanced in PvP first. So once they were balanced against each other, then I could balance them against world mobs. I wanted all of them to be iconically different. So both in your head and visually, they should be distinctive enough that you immediately know the difference between them when you see them. And then finally, all the class designs should be pervaded with this sense of darkness, this doom and gloom kind of vibe that I just wanted to be in this game. So let's take a look at the classes. Oh wait, let's take a look at what they shared in common first. All of them should have an automatic melee attack, meaning once you start it, they just do it whenever they can. If something comes close to them and they have a melee attack, they do it automatically. I also wanted most of the classes, I didn't require it, but I said I'm going to try to get as many of the classes as possible to have an automatic ranged attack. Meaning, if they weren't doing anything else, they'd be doing a ranged attack that either didn't use ammunition or didn't use mana or something like that. They would just do an automatic ranged attack. I wanted all of them to be able to have some kind of self-healing, which we were calling recover, meaning they could heal themselves in the absence of having anyone else around. This is how we supported solo play, and this is how we kind of got around needing a particular class in a raid because everybody could heal themselves. When we were designing the talent trees, I always wanted them to be two completely separate, disjoint talent trees, and then a third one which was kind of a hybrid between the two. And then finally, I wanted the abilities to progress by character level. So there were some abilities you got that got more powerful and some abilities that you got when you attained a level. So level was how we staged progression for classes. Okay, now let's go through the classes. The first one is Warrior. This is your basic fighter. He does tanking and melee DPS. He wields only two-handed weapons. So when you see a big two-handed weapon in somebody, probably in full armor, you know it's a warrior. They would wear battle armor, very distinctive looking. Their weapons would be a two-handed melee weapon, and they had a two-handed gun, because remember, I wanted classes to have a ranged attack. The resource they used was adrenaline. This increases over combat, so you start off without any adrenaline, and it builds, which means you build toward doing your special attacks. And then the special thing about this class I wrote was, if there's one class that can brutally beat down any enemy into submission, this is that class. Next class was Sorcerer. This was the ranged DPS class. The visual for them was they were always had some kind of particle effect going on around them. Just looking at them, you're like, that's a magical person. They wore arcane armor, which is very distinctive. Often had glyphs and sigils and glowy bits. They would use a two-handed staff. So they were the only ones to use that. So they were visually very obvious. And that was their melee attack. And then they could socket runes into that staff to use as a resource to do different spells that they had. And then I said, if there's one class that can harness pure magical energy to destroy their enemies, that's this class. Next one was the Medic. The Medic, you could think of it as our healing class. He did the healing role. He could also buff friends and debuff enemies. His iconic thing was he had a power glove. All of his abilities came out of these big gloves he wore that were glowing. And that's how he'd heal people. That's how he'd buff and debuff people. His armor was called reflex armor. Very distinctive. His main weapon, he may not be holding something. They were his gloves. So even his attacks came out of his gloves. And then his resource was energy. He'd start with full energy, and then it would return over time. Originally, we wrote it returned over time outside of combat. I think we were thinking of it would come back slowly in combat, but there were ways for him to get it from enemies. He could pull energy in, and then outside of combat, it regenerated quickly. So I wrote, if there's one class that can bolster their friends while simultaneously weakening their enemies, it's this class. The next one was the Spellslinger. The idea for this class actually came from, I believe it was Corey Loftus, the concept artist, the lead concept artist. I loved the look and I loved the idea. This was a melee and ranged DPS with some stealth capability. The idea here is they used guns and magic. They looked like they were always dual wielding guns. Their armor was also reflex armor, like we saw in another class already. They always had two pistols, but they also had a sword, so they could get that melee attack. Their resource was ammo. Ammo had to be reloaded occasionally. So occasionally after shooting their guns, there would be a pause while it got reloaded. And the amount that could be reloaded and how fast it took depended on the gun. And then I wrote, if there's one class that can change the tide of battle in an instant, it's this class. By the way, the Spellslinger ended up doing glyphs that got thrown on the ground. That was the source of their magic. So they would root things, buff their friends if they stayed within the glyph radius. It was really cool stuff like that. The Engineer. This was supposed to be our tank class, but he could also heal. He had a pet that could do DPS, and his pet could also tank. His icon was he would build different bots. He could create different kinds of pets depending on what kind of battle it was. He wore battle armor, like the fighter. He had a two-handed gun and a big two-handed wrench. That was his range and attack and melee attack. His resource, which were the build bots. He had to build and maintain these robots. And he could keep them buffed and stuff. He basically managed his bots, which then did a big chunk of work in combat, either doing damage or healing or buffing. So I wrote, if there's one class that can handle multiple foes by a combination of dealing damage to some, distracting others, and just plain taking damage, that's this class. The next one was the Charmer. The Charmer was a really interesting class. He was a combination tank, healer, pet DPS, DPS himself, both melee and ranged. He would have animal companions with him. He basically could get animal companions from the world to follow him around. He wore arcane armor, like the sorcerer did. He used a one-handed crook, which was very distinctive, and his resource were his animals. He had to manage those animals. And I said, if there's one class that can perform as an entire group all by itself, it's this class. He can tank, he can heal, he can do various kinds of DPSs, and so can his pets. So that was an interesting class. This was very obviously one that you could solo with. The next class was called the Dark Weaver. He was kind of supposed to be a different take on a different kind of sorcerer. Because he could do melee and range DPS, and he also had a pet that could do DPS. He was always surrounded by particle effects, but they were very dark, very distinctively colored, and also dark. So he was visually distinct from the sorcerer. His armor was called focal armor. It always had glowing bits on it, and you could tell how it was charged. He used a scythe in combat, and his resource was mana, which, again, is something that returned quickly outside of combat. But inside of combat, he had to manage. It might come back slowly. He might have a way of restoring it with potions. He also might have a way of pulling mana in from enemies. And I wrote, if there's one class that can fight fire with fire in a war against shadow, it's this class. The next one was the Stalker. He's kind of our stealth assassin class. Melee DPS, could tank, very strong in stealth. His icon was he was covered in tattoos, his skin, and he had glowing eyes. You could easily see that somebody was a Stalker just from those things. He wore reflex armor, but not all the parts of it were rendered. So it was like maybe the central part and maybe his arms and legs didn't have the reflex armor. So reflex armor on him looked different than the other two classes that were using it. He tended to use fist weapons like brass knuckles or knife blades or things like that. And his resource was wounds. Whenever he did damage, it would create wounds on the enemy. He could then convert that into direct damage. That would do direct damage, and then later that would become a dot as they bleed from it. If this sounds familiar, I used something similar to this in Pillars of Eternity. His ability was both called the Dark Gift and Rift Walking. He basically could move among shadows and do some really cool things with creating spotches of darkness and glowing crevices in the side of the wall, and he could slip in and out of places. And I wrote, if there's one class that could hold its own against multiple enemies, even at range, with nothing but his fists, this is that class. Then we had the Esper. The Esper is something that may seem familiar to anybody who liked playing the Cypher in Pillars of Eternity. They did crowd control, they could do healing, they could do buffing, they could do debuffing. Their icon was a nimbus around their head. If you saw someone whose head was glowing, it's an Esper. They used focal armor as well, the armor with the glowing bits on it. Their armor was a one-handed energy weapon, so it was a sword whose blade was glowing. Their resource was focus energy. This would increase over time as long as they stayed on the same enemy. So basically, when they started fighting an enemy and kept that one enemy their target, their focal energy would grow quickly, which then let them do more powerful abilities. That which included phantom damage, was a very rare damage type that was hard to defend against. They could also create phobias in their enemies, which would make them afraid to attack him or afraid to attack their friends, which is a great debuff. They could also do predictions where they would basically say, like, they or one of their friends had to do something in a certain amount of time, and if they did it, they'd get a buff. And then the enemies, like he'd say, you can't use this ability in a certain period of time or you will get debuffed. So it was a really interesting way of temporarily debuffing someone. If you use your AoE, enemy guy, you'll get debuffed. My friends, you got to heal someone in the next 10 seconds, and then we're all going to buff. And I wrote, if there's one class that can sow confusion in the ranks of enemies, it's this class. So those were the classes I made. And then coming soon, I said I was gonna highly detail these classes all the way up to level 20. I was going to do talent trees. I was going to explain in more detail how PvP worked, and also talk about how trade skills and crafting would work. Anyway, I hope you guys liked that glimpse into what Wildstar was like in November of 2008.